Tennant spots a glimmer of hope.
What he notices is there is this mole, this sort of breakwater that extends kind of a mile plus out into the sea.
It's really to protect a harbour. You're not supposed to use it as a means of getting on ships, but of course, it's needs must at Dunkirk.
So he thinks, all right, let's try and use it as a jetty. And it worked.
And the reason it's a game changer is because if you can get a big ship coming alongside a mole, a destroyer, a paddle steamer, something of that type, you can load an awful lot of soldiers onto it relatively quickly, and far more people escape from the mole than they did from the beaches.
Tennant's discovery of the mole isn't the only example of ingenuity in action at Dunkirk.
The race to get to the beach is paramount for the soldiers, and they're encumbered with heavy guns, artillery. Some of them have trucks, there are even tanks and all sorts of other equipment, the detritus of war, and they realize that they're not going to be able to bring this with them.
Approximately 85,000 vehicles are left behind by men fleeing for the coast. But whilst waiting to be rescued, a group of Royal Engineers come up with a cunning idea.
People could see the big mole at one end, and otherwise people were just having to queue along the beaches, and they thought we could build our own jetties, and we could do it using lorries. Once they burst the tires, they would push them out in a line. They would attach them to each other. They would put sandbags along the top and then wooden planking on top of that. And then they had made themselves a pier. And so this type of ingenuity was one of the ways that people got by at Dunkirk, and one of the ways that they made things just slightly easier for themselves.
The number of men evacuated from Dunkirk has now more than doubled to over 25,000.
We're talking about something like 10 miles of beaches, hundreds of thousands of people. So every kind of human life was on those beaches.
Lots of different people have different experiences of Dunkirk. For some, it's just one of absolute chaos. Some people are just getting their head down in the dunes and getting some sleep because they're so exhausted. Other people are raiding the bars and cafes and trying to get some drink. And very often the water's already been turned off. The mains has been burst in Dunkirk, so there's no running water. So they're kind of getting drunk on wine, but at least it's fluid.
You had people playing cricket on the beach. You had a circus performer who was doing tricks on the back of a horse that he found. One man I spoke to who loved motorcycles found a motorcycle, and he was going up and down the beach just having the time of his life. People were having fun. People were having terrible times. People were fighting. People were being orderly. People were being disorderly. People were being people. That's what you had on the beaches.
As the evacuees wait to be rescued, in the towns surrounding the port, a battle is raging. Thousands of men are defending the perimeter around Dunkirk. 25 miles in length and 8 miles deep, it's made up of a system of canals and waterways, with the French defending the west and the British in the east. The order to these rearguard units is simple: fight to the last man.
I think one of the most heroic and often unrecognized stories of the Dunkirk evacuation is these last-ditch stands that are happening all over the defensive perimeter around Dunkirk. We think of the ships, we think of the heroism of the Navy, and we often forget that a lot of soldiers sacrificed themselves so that their fellows could get away.
They were told they were going to be defending this perimeter. They said that wave after wave after wave of soldiers came past them, but that was how it was going to be. They were going to have to sacrifice themselves if it was necessary. So it was an enormously selfless and incredibly dangerous job.
Back in London, Churchill is watching and waiting to see how many men of the British Expeditionary Force can be saved. Meanwhile, his foreign secretary, Lord Halifax, is still intent on reaching a peace agreement with Hitler. Realizing he needs to put a stop to Halifax's persistence, Churchill calls for a full cabinet meeting involving ministers from across all parties.
What he tells the full cabinet is an unvarnished account of what's happening in France. He makes no bones about the difficulty therein. But what he also says is what will be the consequences if we give in now. And that will be Britain is reduced to a slave state. And I suppose the most dramatic part of this speech is the final bit where he says, if our island story is to end here, let it only end when each one of us is choking in his own blood, lying on the ground. The response to this meeting, according to Churchill, was a huge outbreak of cheering from the other members of the cabinet, and it was quite clear from this point onwards that they wanted to continue the fight.
It's clear to Halifax there can be no more secret talks regarding peace with Hitler. Instead, Britain needs a miracle. Over 40,000 men have now been rescued, thanks in no small part to the weather.
The weather plays a key role in the Dunkirk evacuation, and at first it's on the side of the Allies, so you get a lot of cloud cover, a lot of difficulty for the German Luftwaffe to observe what's going on the ground. And while this is happening, an awful lot of soldiers are able to get away.
I mean, it's tempting to think that it was all ingenuity and people working out how to do things that got the British home, but actually there was quite a lot of chance involved as well.
But during the afternoon, the skies begin to clear. The RAF defend the area in full force, but seizing the opportunity of clear skies, Goering's Luftwaffe begin their most brutal bombing raid since the start of the evacuation.
So the situation for the British becomes much more dire when the weather clears, because now you've got the Luftwaffe flying, pretty much unchecked over the beaches and strafing and bombing at will.
The Luftwaffe is very young, very keen, very National Socialist spirit, and they want to sink ships, and they want to defeat the enemy as fast as possible. And they don't really think so much about the suffering of the troops when they hit the beach.
Casting off from the mole is a Thames paddle steamer named the Crested Eagle. In peacetime, she was used by day trippers visiting seaside resorts along the English coast. Then, at the start of the war, to evacuate children. At Dunkirk, she is carrying 600 troops back to Britain when the Luftwaffe's Stukas spot her preparing to leave.
The very nature of Stukas is that you dive down as close as you possibly can before you drop your ordnance so that you can make yourself more accurate. That's the whole point.
They would dive very nearly vertically, and they would come out of their dive at something like 1,500 feet. And they carried one large bomb and two smaller bombs on each wing. And also they screamed.
The sirens were added to the Stukas in order to terrorize the troops, in order to increase the fear of a Stuka attack.
So when they targeted ships on the mole or out to sea, or even people on the beaches, they could do a hell of a lot of damage.
4 bombs hit the Crested Eagle in quick succession, transforming it into a blazing inferno.
The carnage they cause is indescribable. Survivors talk about seeing others who are unrecognizable because the damage to their faces was so bad. People were jumping off. People were... one man managed to get to shore, and only when he was on shore he realized that his hands were ribbons because the skin had just peeled completely away.
Approximately 300 men die in the attack. Even so, the captain is able to run the Crested Eagle aground. She's not the only ship to suffer severe losses that day. 10 destroyers, 8 personnel ships, and a number of smaller vessels are annihilated.
And, you know, can you imagine what it must have been like? You're on the mole, you've been waiting there for hours, you've finally got on a ship, you think deliverance is near at hand, and then boom, your ship is blown to pieces.